Did you honestly think a couple of ordinary black folks could just stroll into the city's most exclusive club without an invitation?
Preston Wexley sneered. He lunged forward with a sudden burst of motion, driving his whole hostile weight into a shove that pushed the elderly 78-year-old black man backward against the cold limestone wall.
Look at those flat, cheap shoes and that plain coat. Perhaps you mistook this elite establishment for the garbage diner down the block where people of your kind belong.
With a rapid, forceful motion, Preston seized the old man's invitation card and ripped it from his fingers. His face contorted in fury as he tore the paper apart with both hands, sending a chaotic cloud of flying fragments drifting down onto the granite floor.
Get out before I have security throw you down the granite steps!
The elderly black man stood frozen, his body trembling as he pressed his hand flat against the worn brass badge tucked inside his jacket. A badge he had earned from serving 41 years in this exact room. Beside him, his daughter remained completely calm, her eyes turning to pure ice as the wealthy crowd around them mocked the way they looked. The floor captain had no idea that the silent black woman he had just humiliated did not need an invitation. He had no clue that she secretly owned every brick of this heritage building, the club's founding charter, and the very company that signed his paychecks. If you have ever been judged by a stranger's cruel glance, stay right here, because tonight someone is about to learn the devastating price of insulting the wrong family. Welcome back to The Silent Verdict. Today we bring you a powerful story of hidden authority, silent dignity, and a cold, unstoppable justice that completely dismantled a corrupt system. Let us see what happened when a cruel, elitist room finally met the one person who actually owned it. To understand why that torn invitation drifting to the floor mattered so much, you have to go back many years, long before that night, to a young man who believed that work done well was a kind of quiet prayer. His name was Cornelius Bellamy, and he came to Halford House when he was 23 years old. In a borrowed coat with his shoes shined so bright, he could see his own nervous face in the leather. Halford House was already old then. It was a great stone building in the heart of the city, with a wide flight of granite steps rising to tall brass doors. And above those doors, a carved crest that had looked down on senators, magnates, judges, and heirs for more than 100 years. Inside lived the Halford Club, the most exclusive private club in the city, a place where membership was not bought so much as inherited, where the names on the roster were the same names that hung on the walls of banks and museums and courthouses. To work there was considered an honor. To belong there was considered a birthright. And it was a birthright handed only to a certain kind of person. Cornelius was not that kind of person, and everyone made sure he understood it from his very first day. He was hired as a junior server, the lowest rung, the one who carried and cleared and never spoke unless spoken to. He was told which door to use, and it was not the grand front entrance with the granite steps. It was a narrow service door around the side, down a half flight, past the bins, where the staff slipped in and out as though the building were ashamed of them. For 41 years, Cornelius Bellamy walked through that side door. In 4 decades, he never once climbed those front steps as anything other than a man who was not allowed to. But he was good. That part no one could take from him. He learned the weight of every glass and the fold of every napkin. He learned how to pour wine so the bottle never touched the rim, how to clear a plate so quietly the conversation never paused, how to remember that the gentleman at table 9 took his coffee black, and the lady at table 4 could not abide the smell of lilies. He learned the rhythm of the room, the way a musician learns a song, until he could move through a crowded dining floor, carrying a heavy tray above his shoulder and never brush a single elbow. The members never learned his name. For 41 years they called him by whatever name was convenient. Some called him Boy, though many of them were younger than he was. Some snapped their fingers. Some simply did not look at him at all. The way you do not look at a chair or a lamp or a thing that exists only to serve you, and Cornelius served them anyway, with a straight back and steady hands. And he carried home every night a dignity that no one in that building had given him, and no one in that building could take away. The club gave its long-serving staff one small token. Each member of the service team wore a little brass badge engraved with the house crest and a number that marked the order in which they had been hired. Most badges came and went as people quit or were let go. But Cornelius stayed. Year after year. Decade after decade. Until the brass of his badge had been rubbed soft and smooth by the press of his own thumb. Because he had a habit, in the hardest moments, of pressing his hand flat against it through his shirt. The way some people touch a cross or a photograph, that badge marked him as the longest-serving man ever to wear one in the history of Halford House. When he finally retired, the club gave him no party and no speech, but they let him keep the badge, and that one small kindness was, in 41 years, very nearly the only one he ever received from them. There was one night in particular that his daughter would carry with her for the rest of her life, though she had heard it told only once, and quietly, when she was nearly grown. It was the night of a great gala at the Halford Club, the kind of evening when the most important people in the city filled the grand dining room and the chandeliers blazed and the wine never stopped. Cornelius had worked that night for 11 hours without a break, on feet that had already given the club 30 years. Near the end of the evening, a young man, the son of a powerful family, drunk and laughing, called him over, and when Cornelius came, the young man deliberately tipped a full glass of red wine onto the floor at the old man's feet, and then pointed at it and said, in front of the whole laughing table, "Clean that up, boy, and be quick about it." And Cornelius, who was older than the young man's own father, lowered himself down onto his knees on that hard floor, in his pressed uniform, in front of a table of laughing strangers, and cleaned up wine that had been spilled on purpose to humiliate him. Not one person at that table, and not one person at any of the tables around it, said a single word. He never told his daughter the young man's name. He only told her, when she asked him years later why he had stayed, why he had not walked out that very night, that he had a daughter to raise and a rent to pay, and that a man does not get to choose whether the world will be cruel to him. He only gets to choose whether he will let the cruelty turn him cruel. He had decided, kneeling on that floor, that it would not, and he had gone home that night, and kissed his sleeping daughter, and pressed his thumb to his brass badge, and gone back the next morning through the side door with his back straight. That was the man Preston Wexley would one day shove against a wall and call garbage. He had a daughter. Her name was Adiza, though the world would later come to know her as Ada Bellamy. She grew up in a small apartment across the city, and her earliest memories were of her father at the kitchen table before dawn, pressing his uniform with an iron until the creases were sharp as blades, polishing his shoes, and pinning that little brass badge over his heart. She remembered him leaving in the dark and coming home in the dark. She remembered the smell of the kitchens that clung to his coat, and the careful, weary way he would sit and ease off his shoes after a double shift, and how he never, not once, complained. But she was a watchful child, and children see far more than we think. She heard, when she was old enough to understand, the things he let slip without meaning to. The member who had thrown a napkin at his chest and told him to mind his clumsy hands when it was the member who had knocked over the glass. The manager who had docked his pay for a breakage he did not cause. And one night, when she was nearly grown, she heard the story of the spilled wine and the hard floor, and her father on his knees. And she understood something then that she would never afterward be able to unfeel. She watched her father absorb 4 decades of small cruelties and bend none of them onto her. And somewhere in her watching, a fury was born and banked, like coals covered for the night, so they will still be burning in the morning. She did not yet know what she would do with it. She only knew that a man as fine as her father deserved a world that could see him, and that the world he gave his life to could not. What Ada did with that banked fury was build. She was relentless, in the way that only a child who has watched a parent be diminished can be relentless. She studied as though every grade were a brick in a wall that would one day protect the people she loved. She won a scholarship, and then another. She went into finance, into the rooms where money is moved and futures are decided. And she discovered that she had a gift for seeing the true value of things long before other people noticed it. She was patient. She was precise. She was, when she needed to be, colder than any man across the table from her, because she had learned the cost of warmth wasted on people who would only take it. By the time she was in her 40s, Ada Bellamy had built something formidable. Her firm was called Ironwood Partners, and through it, she controlled investments and real estate across the country. Quiet holdings layered inside other holdings. The kind of ownership that does not announce itself with a name on a tower but simply, calmly, decides what happens. She had also built something she cared about even more than the firm. She founded a foundation called the Lantern, which put its weight behind the people the world overlooks. The workers and the families and the neighborhoods that the powerful step around. She had become, without ever raising her voice, one of the most influential people in the city, and almost no one outside her closest circle knew her face, because she had learned from her father that the most powerful thing in any room is often the person no one bothers to look at. She never forgot Halford House. How could she? It lived in her like a splinter under the skin. The place that had used up 4 decades of her father's life and given him a side door and a smooth brass badge in return. So she watched it, the way she watched everything. And she waited. And then, a few years before that night, the waiting paid off. The Heritage Building itself, Halford House, the great stone landmark with the granite steps, came quietly onto the market when the old family trust that had held it for generations finally faltered. At the same time, the parent company that owned and operated the Halford Club, the corporation that held its charter and signed the paychecks of every man and woman who worked there, found itself short of capital and looking for an investor who would be discreet. Ada Bellamy moved the way she always moved, through holding companies and patient lawyers, never once letting her own name surface where anyone at the club might see it. She bought the building. She bought the granite steps and the limestone walls and the tall brass doors and the carved crest above them. She acquired a controlling majority of the parent company, 61%, enough to decide anything she wished to decide. And she came to hold, in her own hands, the founding charter of the Halford Club, the very document that gave the club its right to exist inside those walls. She did all of it in silence. That was the part that mattered. The members never knew. The secretary never knew. The floor captain, who would one day shove her father against a wall, never knew. They all believed the club still answered, as it always had, to the same anonymous old trust, a distant and faceless authority that shared their values and protected their world. They had no idea that the trust now answered to a woman, and that the woman was the daughter of a man they had spent 41 years looking straight through. People who learned the truth later sometimes asked Ada why she had done it. Why spend a fortune and years of patience to quietly take ownership of the one place that had wounded her family most? They assumed the answer was revenge. And they were not entirely wrong. But they were not right either. Revenge was the smallest part of it. Ada Bellamy bought Halford House for two reasons that mattered far more. The first reason was that she wanted to change it. She had spent her whole life watching institutions decide who belonged and who did not. And here was one she could finally hold in her own hands and remake from the foundation up. The second reason was tender. And she told almost no one. She wanted, one day, to bring her father back through the front doors he had never been allowed to use, and to seat him at one of the tables he had spent 41 years serving, and to let him be, for one evening, the honored guest in the room that had treated him as furniture. She wanted to give him that before it was too late, and she wanted to see, with her own eyes, whether the place had changed in the years since he left it, or whether, when it believed no one important was watching, it would show her exactly what it had always been. She got her answer. It came faster and uglier than even she had feared. The occasion was her father's 78th birthday. Ada planned it quietly. The way she planned everything. She did not want a spectacle. She wanted a dinner. She arranged, through the club's ordinary guest process, a legitimate reservation and a proper printed invitation, the kind the club issued to guests of standing, with the house crest embossed at the top and the date written in fine dark ink. She placed it under a name that would not draw attention. She told her father almost nothing. She only said that she was taking him somewhere special for his birthday, somewhere he would never expect, and that he should wear his very best. And here is a detail that tells you everything about Ada Bellamy. On the night of the dinner, she dressed plainly on purpose. She wore a simple dark coat, well made but unremarkable. The kind of coat 1,000 ordinary women wear on a cold evening. She wore no jewelry that mattered, nothing that glittered, nothing that whispered money to a trained and greedy eye. She let her hands be bare. She wanted, that night, to walk into Halford House, looking exactly the way her father had always been seen by that place. As an ordinary black person of no apparent importance, a person the powerful do not bother to look at twice. She did it because she wanted the truth. And she knew that the truth only shows itself when a place believes there is no one in the room worth being careful around. She would learn what Halford House truly was by letting it treat her as nothing. Cornelius, for his part, had no idea what was coming, and his innocence in that moment is almost unbearable to picture. He put on his best coat, a plain dark wool coat, old but carefully kept, brushed and pressed. He shined his shoes until they gleamed. The same flat, sensible shoes a working man buys to last. And without quite knowing why, perhaps out of 41 years of habit, perhaps because some part of him sensed where they were going, he slipped his worn brass badge into the breast pocket of his coat, over his heart, the way he had carried it every working day of his life. When the car turned onto the familiar street, and Cornelius saw the great stone front of Halford House rising up ahead of them, lit golden against the dark, he went very quiet. Ada watched her father's face. She watched him recognize the building that had taken 4 decades of his life. She watched him understand that they were stopping here, that the granite steps in front of them, the steps he had been forbidden to climb for 41 years, were the steps his own daughter was about to walk him up, through the front doors. As a guest, his eyes filled. His hand, resting on his knee, began to tremble, not with fear, but with a joy so large and so unfamiliar that his body did not quite know how to hold it. Ada, he said softly, and could not finish. She took his hand. Happy birthday? Daddy, she said. Tonight you go in the front. They climbed the granite steps together, the old man and his daughter, and for a moment, a single bright moment. It was everything Ada had dreamed it would be. And then they stepped through the tall brass doors into the marble foyer, beneath the great chandelier. And they met Preston Wexley. You should understand who Preston Wexley was. Because men like him exist in every gilded room, and they do more damage than the people above them ever admit. Preston was the floor captain of the Halford Club, a man in his middle 40s who had clawed his way up from nothing to a position of small but jealously guarded authority, and who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the surest sign of his own importance was the power to decide who did not belong. He thought of himself as the guardian of the club's standards. He had a sharp, hungry eye for anyone whose clothes, or shoes, or skin did not match the picture in his head of what a Halford guest should look like. And he took a particular, ugly pleasure in turning such people away. He had done it to delivery men who came to the wrong door. He had done it to a young scholarship student who arrived as the legitimate guest of a member and left in tears. He patrolled that marble foyer like a man guarding a border, and the thing he guarded most fiercely was the line between the people he had decided were worthy and the people he had decided were not. When Preston saw Cornelius and Ada step through the doors, he did not see an honored guest and his daughter. He saw an old black man in a plain coat and flat shoes, and a quiet black woman beside him in an unremarkable coat. And in the space of a single contemptuous glance, he decided everything he thought he needed to know about them. He crossed the foyer fast, his polished shoes clicking on the marble, and he put himself directly in their path. What happened next happened in front of perhaps 30 people. Members stood at the long bar to one side and sat at the white-clothed tables beyond. Old money at its ease, and many of them turned to watch with the lazy, amused contempt of people who expect to be entertained by someone else's humiliation. At a prominent table near the center sat Dwight Halloran, the chair of the club's membership committee, a heavy, satisfied man who had spent years quietly deciding who would and would not be allowed to join, and who watched Preston move on the newcomers with the cold approval of a man seeing his own values enforced. Near the coat check stood a young woman named Marisol Reyes, who had worked at the club only a short while, and whose face, as the scene unfolded, would be the only face in that entire room that showed what a decent person ought to feel. Cornelius, polite as he had been for 41 years, reached into his coat and drew out the embossed invitation, and began to offer it. "Good evening," he said. "My daughter and I have a reservation. He never finished. Preston barely glanced at the card. "Did you honestly think a couple of ordinary black folks could just stroll into the city's most exclusive club without an invitation?" he sneered. And then he lunged, driving his whole weight into a shove that sent the 78-year-old man stumbling backward against the cold limestone wall. Cornelius's shoulder struck the stone. A small, stunned sound left him. "Look at those flat, cheap shoes and that plain coat," Preston spat, looming over the old man. "Perhaps you mistook this elite establishment for the garbage diner down the block, where people of your kind belong." And then he reached out, seized the invitation from Cornelius's trembling fingers, and tore it apart with both hands, hard, twice, 3 times, until the embossed paper with the house crest was nothing but a chaotic cloud of fragments drifting down onto the granite floor. "Get out," Preston said. "Before I have security throw you down the granite steps." For a moment the old man could not move. Cornelius Bellamy stood pressed against the limestone wall where the shove had left him, his body shaking, his breath coming short and shallow, and his hand rose by an instinct older than thought and pressed flat against his chest, against the worn brass badge inside his coat, the badge he had earned in this exact room. In 41 years of folding their napkins and pouring their wine and clearing their plates and being called boy by men half his age, the fragments of the invitation his daughter had so carefully arranged settled around his shined shoes like falling ash. And in that frozen moment, pressed against the cold stone with his hand over his badge, Cornelius Bellamy was not only 78 years old in a marble foyer, he was every age he had ever been in this building at once. He was 23 and terrified at the side door. He was 50 and on his knees on a hard floor cleaning up wine spilled for sport. He was 64 and being called boy by a young man whose grandfather he had served. He had swallowed all of it. For 41 years. Because he had a daughter to raise, and because he had decided long ago that he would not let their cruelty make him cruel. He had believed. When he finally retired and walked out that side door for the last time, that he had left all of it behind him, and now here it was again. The same contempt, the same hands, the same room, finding him in his old age on what was meant to be the happiest night his daughter had ever given him, and pressing his face once more into the truth that places like this had spent his whole life teaching him, that no matter how well he served, no matter how straight he kept his back, to them he would never be a man. His eyes burned, his hand shook against the brass, and the worst of it, the thing that nearly broke the unbreakable old man at last, was not the shove or the torn paper. It was that it was happening in front of his daughter, and the room laughed. That is the part that should stay with you. Not just that one cruel man did a cruel thing, but that a room full of comfortable, powerful people watched a 78-year-old man get shoved against a wall and found it amusing. A woman at the bar named Cordelia Vance laughed behind the rim of her wine glass and murmured something to the man beside her about the sort of people one has to keep out these days. Phones came up. Several members lifted their phones. Not to help. Not to record a wrong so that it could be answered, but to capture the spectacle for their own entertainment, to have a little story to share later. At his center table, Dwight Halloran smiled into his drink. The cruelty had an audience, and the audience approved. Only one person in that room moved toward the old man. Marisol Reyes, at the coat check, took a single step forward, her hand half rising, her face stricken with the plain human horror that everyone else in that room had somehow misplaced. She opened her mouth, and then she stopped. She was new. She needed the job. She had seen what Preston did to people who crossed him, and she had rent to pay and a family that depended on the small wage this place gave her. And so the fear closed over the decency like water closing over a stone. And she froze where she stood, her step unfinished, her hand falling back to her side. She would remember that unfinished step for the rest of her life. So, as it happens, would Ada? It was at this moment that the club secretary arrived. His name was Lawrence Price, and he was a different, and in some ways, more dangerous animal than Preston Wexley. Where Preston was raw and loud, Price was smooth and cold. A tall, precise man in an expensive suit who carried the unbothered confidence of someone who has never in his life had his own belonging questioned. He had heard the commotion and come gliding out from the inner rooms, and a decent man in his position, seeing an elderly guest shoved against a wall and his invitation in pieces on the floor, would have been horrified. Price was not horrified. Price looked at the old black man and his daughter, and he looked at the torn invitation, and he made the same calculation Preston had made, only in colder and more polished terms. "Is there a problem here?" Price said, and it was not really a question. He stepped beside Preston, the two of them forming a wall, and he addressed Cornelius and Ada with the weary, condescending courtesy that is so much worse than open rage. "I am the club's secretary. I am afraid that whatever you believe you are doing here, this is a private club, with certain standards, and an obligation to the comfort of our members. We cannot simply admit anyone who appears at the door. I'm going to have to ask the two of you to leave the premises immediately, and to do so quietly, before this becomes any more of a scene than my colleague has already made it." He glanced at the fragments on the floor, then back at the old man, and added, with a small, distasteful tightening of his mouth, "I do not know how you came to be under the impression that you would be welcome here, but you are not." There it was. Not the heat of one cruel man, but the cold machinery of an institution, calmly confirming that this man and his daughter did not belong, citing standards and comfort and the obligations of a private club. All the smooth and reasonable words that powerful places have always used to dress up an ugly and simple thing. Preston had supplied the violence. Price supplied the permission, and around them, the members watched and waited to see the old man and his daughter turned out into the night. Through all of it, Ada Bellamy had not said a single word. She had not moved to her father when he was shoved. Though every nerve in her body had screamed to, she had not cried out, had not argued, had not begged anyone to see reason. She had simply stood there, very still, in her plain dark coat, and she had watched Preston's face as he tore the invitation. She had watched Cordelia Vance laugh behind her glass, and the phones come up, and Dwight Halloran smile into his drink. She had watched Marisol Reyes take one step and stop. She had watched Lawrence Price glide out and choose, in cold and certain words, the wrong side. And while she watched, something happened in Ada's eyes that the people in that room were too pleased with themselves to notice. They turned to ice, not the hot, wet anger of a person who has been wounded, but the still, clear, bottomless cold of a person who has just been handed absolute proof, and who has decided, with perfect calm, exactly what is going to happen now. Because here is what the floor captain did not know. Here is what the club secretary, with all his talk of standards, did not know. Here is what the laughing members and the smiling membership chair did not know. The silent black woman they had all decided was nothing. The woman in the plain coat, whom they had not bothered to look at twice, did not need their invitation. She did not need their permission. She owned every brick of the building they were standing in. She owned the granite steps Preston had threatened to throw her father down, and the limestone wall he had shoved him against, and the great brass doors and the carved crest above them. She held the club's founding charter in her own hands, and she held a controlling stake in the very company that signed the paychecks of every person in that room who worked there, including the two men standing in front of her, smiling, who had just made the single greatest mistake of their lives. When Ada finally spoke, her voice was quiet. It was so quiet that the people nearest had to still themselves to hear it. And that quiet was somehow more frightening than any shout could have been. "What is your name?" she said to Preston. Preston blinked, thrown for half a second by the calm of the question. And then his sneer returned, because he could not imagine any world in which this woman's question mattered. "My name," he said, with a short, ugly laugh. "I am the floor captain of this club, and you are a woman who is about to be removed from it. That is all the name you need to know." But Ada only looked at him, patient and unblinking. And there was something in that look that made even Preston's certainty waver, so that at last, almost against his will, he said it. "Wexley, Preston Wexley. Now get your father and yours," Ada said, turning to the club secretary as though Preston had not spoken at all. Price drew himself up, affronted at being addressed like a clerk. "Lawrence Price," he said coldly, "club secretary. And I will thank you to understand that your little questions change nothing. I have asked you to leave. The next time I ask, it will be with security beside me. I would strongly advise." "Are you quite sure," Ada said, "that the two of you want to proceed?" It should have been a warning. Everything in her stillness, in the ice of her eyes, in the strange, unhurried confidence of a woman who had just been shoved toward the door and yet stood there as though she owned the floor, should have warned them. But arrogance does not hear warnings. Preston laughed again. Price gave a thin, dismissive smile, and from his table at the center of the room, Dwight Halloran chuckled. A wet, satisfied sound, and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I do believe the woman thinks she is somebody." A ripple of amusement moved through the watching members. They thought they were nearing the best part. They had no idea they had just walked, all of them together, off the edge of a cliff. Ada Bellamy reached into the slim leather portfolio she had carried in under her arm, the one they had all assumed was nothing more than a handbag, and she began to take out documents. And she laid them down, en B1, on the crisp, white tablecloth of the nearest empty table, the very kind of table, as it happened, that her father had spent 41 years setting and clearing in that room. "This," she said, laying down the first heavy document and smoothing it flat with one bare hand, "is the deed to this building, Halford House, the land beneath it, the stone around us, the granite steps your colleague just threatened to throw my father down. It is held by an entity that I control, and I am its principal. I own this building, every brick of it." As a matter of fact, the room had gone very quiet. Ada laid down the second document. "This," she said, "is the capitalization table of the company that owns and operates the Halford Club. The company on the letterhead, the company that signs your paychecks, Mr. Wexley, and yours, Mr. Price. You will see, if either of you can read a cap table, which I rather doubt, that one party holds a controlling majority, 61%. That party is me." She laid down the third document, and this one she did not smooth. She simply set it on the white cloth and rested 2 fingers upon it. "And this," she said, "is the founding charter of the Halford Club. The document that gives this club the right to exist inside these walls that I own. The standards your secretary was lecturing me about a moment ago live in this charter. You hold it, which means, as of this evening, those standards are mine to keep, or mine to tear up, exactly the way your floor captain tore up my father's invitation." No one laughed now. Preston's sneer had begun to slide off his face like something melting. Price had gone the color of paper, and it was into that ringing, dawning silence that the tall brass doors opened again, and 2 people walked in, and the last of the room's comfortable world came apart. The first was a woman, sharp and composed, in a dark and perfect suit, carrying a briefcase, with the unhurried walk of someone who is never in the wrong room. This was Diane Osei, the general counsel of Ironwood Partners, Ada Bellamy's own lawyer, summoned with a single quiet message and arriving exactly on time. The second was a man, and the man mattered, because the members and the staff recognized him, even though most of them had only ever seen his signature. He was Howard Stahl, the president of the parent company that owned the Halford Club, the man whose name appeared at the bottom of the club's official letters, the man who was, on paper, the highest authority any person in that building had ever had occasion to fear. And Howard Stahl walked across that marble foyer, past the staring members and the frozen staff, straight up to the silent black woman in the plain coat whom Preston Wexley had shoved toward the door, and he stopped before her. And the entire room watched the president of the company lower his head in deference. "Madam Chair," Howard Stahl said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I came the moment I received your message. I am so deeply sorry. I had no idea you were here this evening. Or I would have. I know you didn't." "Howard," Ada said quietly, "that is rather the point. I wanted to see what your club does when it does not know I am watching. You could have heard a pin fall on that marble floor. In the space of perhaps 90 seconds, the entire understanding of the room had inverted itself. The old black man in the plain coat was not a trespasser. The silent woman beside him was not a nobody to be thrown into the street. She was the owner. She was the one the president of the company called Madam Chair and bowed his head to. She held the building, the company, and the charter in her two bare hands. And she had been standing there the whole time, watching them all show her, with their laughter and their phones and their cold talk of standards, precisely who they were. Preston Wexley's legs seemed to fail him by degrees. Lawrence Price reached out and steadied himself on the back of a chair. Cordelia Vance set down her wine glass very carefully, as though it had become dangerous. And Dwight Halloran, who had said the woman thought she was somebody, sat at his center table with his satisfied smile gone, understanding at last, in a cold flood, exactly who the woman was. Ada Bellamy looked around the silent room, and then she looked at her father, who stood by the limestone wall with his hand still pressed to the badge over his heart, his eyes wet, watching his daughter with an expression that had no name. And Ada turned back to the room, and she began to deliver her verdict. She did not raise her voice. That was the terrible beauty of it. Ada Bellamy delivered the most devastating verdict that room had ever heard in the same quiet, even tone she might have used to order a glass of water. And somehow the quiet made every word land like a stone dropped into still water. "Mr. Wexley," she said first, turning to the floor captain, who could no longer meet her eyes. "You are dismissed. Effective this moment. You will collect nothing. You will say nothing. And you will be escorted from this building, using, I think, the front steps. Since you are so fond of them, but understand me clearly, because this is the part that matters. Your dismissal is the smallest thing that is going to happen to you tonight. A few minutes ago, in front of more than 30 witnesses, many of whom were so kind as to record it on their phones, you put your hands on a 78-year-old man and drove him into a stone wall. That is not a matter for the club's personnel file. That is an assault on an elderly man. And it is a crime." She turned her head a fraction. Dianose stepped forward, calm as still water. "We have the recordings, or we will have them within the hour," she said. "We will be filing a report with the police tonight, and we will be pursuing a civil action on Mr. Bellamy's behalf for the assault. Mr. Wexley, I would advise you to obtain a lawyer of your own. You are going to need one." Preston Wexley made a small broken sound and said nothing, because there was nothing left in the world for him to say. "Mr. Price," Ada continued, turning to the club secretary, who had not let go of the chair, "you are also dismissed. Effective this moment. And I want you to understand precisely why because I suspect you believe you did nothing wrong. You did not shove my father. You are quite right. What you did was worse. In its way. You arrived. You saw an old man pinned against a wall and his invitation in pieces on the floor, and with all your education and all your fine words about standards, you chose the side of the man who did it. You did not abuse my father with your hands. You did it with the full, cold weight of this institution. And you called it the comfort of your members. The violence needs men like Wexley to throw the punches, Mr. Price. But it needs men like you far more. The polished men who arrive afterward and explain, in reasonable voices, why the punch was justified. You are finished here. Then Ada turned, slowly, to the heavy man at the center table, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop another degree. Mr. Halloran, she said, you thought I believed I was somebody. Let me tell you what I actually believe. I believe that what happened to my father in this foyer tonight was not an accident, and was not the work of one bad man having one bad night. I believe it is the design of this place, and has been for a very long time. And I believe that you, as the chair of the membership committee, are one of the chief architects of that design. She let the words settle. I have, for some time now, had questions about how this club decides who is permitted to join and who is quietly turned away. Tonight answered a great many of them. So here is what is going to happen. Effective immediately. You and the entire membership committee are suspended, beginning tomorrow. An independent firm, reporting to me and to no one in this room, will conduct a full audit of every membership decision this committee has made for the past 15 years. Every application, every rejection, every name that was passed over, and the reasons, spoken and unspoken, that it was passed over. A faint murmur of alarm moved through the watching members, and Ada let it move. And the provisions of this club's charter that have been used to keep certain people out, the very standards Mr. Price was so proud of, will be struck from the document. I hold that charter. I will be exercising that right. Where the audit uncovers conduct that the law should hear about, we will refer it to the appropriate civil rights authorities, and we will cooperate with them fully. Every person who was wrongly turned away by this committee will receive a written apology under this house's name. The machine that made men like Wexley feel entitled to do what he did tonight is being taken apart, piece by piece. Starting now. It was. The people in that room slowly understood. Not a punishment. It was a dismantling. Ada Bellamy was not merely firing the men who had hurt her father. She was reaching past them, into the bones of the institution itself, and pulling out the rod at the root. It was here that one of the members made the last mistake of the evening. A florid man rose from a table near the bar. A man named Bertram Ashworth, who had been a member for 30 years and could not bear to sit silent while his club was dismantled by a woman he had been raised to look past. Now, see here, he blustered. You cannot simply walk in and tear apart an institution with a history older than I can, Ada said, without even turning her head fully toward him. And I am. And you will sit down. The flat finality of it stopped him mid-word. You were going to tell me about this institution's history. Mr. Ashworth, I know its history better than you do. Its history is my father on his knees on that floor, cleaning up wine that was spilled on him for sport, while men like you watched and said nothing. Its history is a side door and a smoothed brass badge, and 41 years of a good man being called boy. That is the history you are asking me to respect. I have read it more closely than any of you, because I lived in the house of the man who survived it. Sit down. Sir, your club's history is precisely the thing I am here to end. And Bertram Ashworth sat down, slowly, and did not say another word. And something in the way the rest of the room watched him sit told you that they had all, finally, understood that there was no argument left to make. Then Ada did something no one expected. She turned and looked, not at the powerful, but at the watching crowd, at the members at the bar and the tables, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had lifted their phones for entertainment, the ones who had watched an old man shoved against a wall and felt nothing but amusement. And she spoke to them, and her voice was as quiet as ever. "I am not going to have you removed," she said. "You have done nothing that the law can touch. But I want to say one thing to you before this night is over, and I want you to carry it home with you." Several of you laughed. Several of you raised your phones to capture my father's humiliation as though it were a show put on for your enjoyment. Most of you simply watched and said nothing and let it happen. And I know that each of you has told yourself, in the last few minutes, that you were not really part of this, that it was Wexley, that it was Price, that you were only a bystander. She paused. You were not only a bystander. The cruelty in this room tonight needed your silence to walk on. It needed your laughter to feel safe. A man like Wexley does not shove an old man against a wall in a room he believes will be horrified. He does it in a room he believes will be entertained. You were that room. I am not going to punish you for it. I am simply going to let you know that I saw you. Every one of you. And that you will have to decide for yourselves what kind of person laughs at that. And she said no more, and let the silence finish the sentence. And there were members in that room who could not lift their eyes from the floor. And that, too, was its own kind of verdict. Last of all, Ada looked toward the coat check, and her face changed. "And you," she said gently, "come here. Please." Marisol Reyes, trembling, came forward. She thought, in that moment, that she was about to lose the job she had been too afraid to risk. Instead, Ada Bellamy looked at her with something close to tenderness. "When my father was driven into that wall," Ada said, "every powerful, comfortable person in this room found it amusing, or found it convenient to look away. You were the only one who moved toward him. You took a step. I saw it. I know the fear that stopped you, and I do not hold it against you, because you have rent to pay, and people who depend on you, and this place taught you exactly what it does to those who step out of line. But you tried. In a room full of people who felt nothing, you were the one whose decency was stronger than your comfort. Even if your fear was stronger still, courage that is interrupted by fear is still courage that tried. And tonight, it was the rarest thing in this building." She paused. "What is being built here next is going to need people who feel what you felt. I would like you to be one of them. Not at the coat check. We will talk about where. But you have a place in what comes next. Miss Reyes. And you have it because when it counted, you were the only one who took a step." Marisol Reyes put her hand over her mouth and wept. And it was, in that whole cold room, the first honest and human sound of the night. And then Ada Bellamy turned to her father, and the steel in her went quiet. And what was left was a daughter. She faced the room one more time, but now she spoke about the old man by the wall. And her voice, for the first time all evening, had something in it that was not ice. "I want all of you to look at this man," she said. "Truly look at him, because not one of you has ever bothered to. His name is Cornelius Bellamy. He is my father, and today is his 78th birthday. And I brought him here tonight because of a thing none of you knew. A thing that your floor captain found so unimaginable that he decided an old black man in plain shoes must have wandered in from a garbage diner. She let her gaze travel across their faces. My father worked in this room for 41 years. The silence sharpened. 41 years. Ada said again. He came here when he was 23 years old. And he gave this club the whole working life of a good man. He poured the wine at these tables. He folded the napkins you put in your laps. He cleared your plates so quietly you never heard him. Because he was that good at a craft that none of you ever once respected. For 41 years he was told to use the side door, never the front. For 41 years he was called boy by men young enough to be his grandsons. He served senators and judges and the fathers and grandfathers of half the people sitting in this room. And in all that time, not one of them ever learned his name. Because to all of you, he was furniture. He was a chair. He was a lamp. He was a thing that brought you what you wanted and was not in your eyes. Quitte à personne. Her voice did not rise. But it filled the room to its corners. And tonight he came back through the front doors for the very first time. On the arm of his daughter, dressed in his very best. To be a guest in the room he gave his life to. And your floor captain shoved him into a wall and threatened to throw him down the steps. The same steps he was never, in 41 years, permitted to climb. No one breathed. You want to know how a man survives that? Ada said, more quietly now. 41 years of being looked through. I will tell you, because I watched him do it. Every night of my childhood, I watched my father iron his uniform at our kitchen table and shine those flat, cheap shoes and pin a little brass badge over his heart, and walk out before dawn to a place that treated him as nothing, and come home after midnight with his back still straight. They never gave him his dignity. They tried, in 1,000 small ways, to take it, and he never let them have it. He carried it home every single night, and he kept it, and he passed it to me. And it is the foundation that everything I am is built upon. Every brick of this building that I own because of the unbroken back of the man your floor captain just called garbage. So you will look at him, and you will remember that you did. It was then that Cornelius Bellamy moved at last. The old man stepped away from the wall, his hand coming down from his heart, and in his fingers, when he drew his hand back, was the worn brass badge. The little disc of metal rubbed soft and smooth by 41 years of his own thumb. He looked at it in his open palm. And then he looked at his daughter. And then, for the first time, he spoke. And his voice shook, but it carried. I never wanted any of this. He said softly, I want you all to know that I never once dreamed of revenge. In 41 years, I never asked this place for anything but the chance to do my work well, and to be paid for it, and to be, just once, seen as a man. His eyes moved slowly around the room, over the faces that had laughed, over the men who had shoved and lectured him. Tonight my daughter has given me a gift I never thought to ask for. Not the building, not their fear. She has made you look at me. After 41 years, you finally see me standing here. That is all I ever wanted. To be seen. And he closed his hand around the badge. And his daughter crossed the floor to him and took his other hand in both of hers. And the powerful room full of comfortable people watched a waiter they had never noticed become, in front of all of them, the only truly dignified person any of them had ever seen. Ada held her father's hand, and she made one last announcement. And it transformed not just that night, but everything that would come after it. The Halford Club, as it has existed, is finished, she said, and her voice was clear and certain. I own this building, and I own its charter, and I am going to use them, This place was built as a fortress, a wall around a small and frightened idea of who is worthy and who is not. That ends now. This building is going to be refounded from the foundation up, and it is going to carry a new name. She looked at her father. It will be called the Cornelius Bellamy House. The old man's breath caught. The grand dining room. Ada went on. The room where my father was never, in 41 years, allowed to sit as a guest, will become a public dining room. It will be open. Anyone may come. No one, ever again, will be sorted at that door by the color of their skin, or the cost of their coat, or the flatness of their shoes. And a part of this building will become something this city has never had. It will become a center for the dignity of service workers, for the cooks and the cleaners and the servers and the porters, the invisible people who make every luxury in every gilded room like this one possible, and who are looked through every day. The way my father was looked through for 41 years, they will have a place here for their training, their advancement, and their protection. The room that erased my father will now carry his name and his purpose. For as long as this building stands, she looked around at the silent, stricken faces one last time. That, she said, is what I believe somebody is. Not a person with a fine coat and an old name and a table at an exclusive club. Somebody is a man who served 41 years with a straight back and never let the world break him. You were standing in his house the whole time. You simply never knew it. The story could end there, and it would already be a story worth telling. But the truest measure of a verdict is not the moment it is delivered. It is what grows in the years that follow. So let me tell you what became of the Cornelius Bellamy house, and of the people in that room, because the silent verdict that Ada Bellamy delivered that night did not stop with the firing of two men. It changed everything it touched. Preston Wexley left the building that night by the front steps, as Ada had said he would, and he did not get to keep his quiet life. The recordings the members had so eagerly taken for their own amusement became, instead, the evidence against him. He answered for laying his hands on a 78-year-old man in a courtroom, the way the law requires. And the civil action that followed took from him a good deal more than the small authority he had loved so much. Lawrence Price, with his fine education and his talk of standards, found that the polished reputation he had built meant nothing once people learned what he had defended, and what he had defended it with. The independent audit of the membership committee went forward, and over the following year it uncovered, in 15 years of quiet rejections, exactly the pattern that Ada had suspected was there, and the names of every person who had been wrongly turned away were found, and every one of them received a letter of apology written under the new house's name. Dwight Halloran did not enjoy that year at all, but it is not the punishments that matter most. Cornelius Bellamy himself would tell you that, and he would tell you sharply, what matters is what was built where the fortress used to stand. Some months later, on a bright evening in spring, the Cornelius Bellamy house opened its doors for the first time, and if you had stood across the street and watched, you would have seen something that the old Halford Club would have considered the end of the world, and that any decent person would call the beginning of one. You would have seen the wide granite steps, the steps Cornelius was forbidden to climb for 41 years. The steps a floor captain once threatened to throw him down, crowded now with people walking up them freely, people of every kind, families, old men and young children, workers still in the clothes of their trades, all of them climbing the front steps and passing through the tall brass doors into the warm gold light. And not one of them stopped at the threshold and asked whether they were worthy enough to enter. Inside, the grand dining room was full. and it was loud, and it was warm, full of the talk and the laughter of people who would never, in the old world, have been permitted past the door. And at the entrance to that room, greeting the guests, welcoming them in, stood Marisol Reyes, who was no longer at the coat check, who held a real place now in the house she had once been too afraid to defend. Standing at the very threshold where she had once frozen with her step unfinished, and welcoming through it everyone the old club would have turned away. And the part of the house that Ada had promised would serve the invisible people was not an empty gesture. The way such promises so often are, it became real. In the lower floors of the building, in rooms that had once stored the club's wine and silver, the Cornelius Bellamy House opened a center that did exactly what Ada had said it would. It trained young people in the trades of service and paid them honestly while they learned. It offered the cooks and cleaners and porters of the whole city a place to come for help when an employer cheated them of their wages, for classes when they wanted to rise, for a hot meal and a moment of rest on a hard day. It kept a fund, quietly, for the workers whose backs and knees and hands had finally given out after decades of labor that no pension had ever been arranged to honor. On the wall of that center, where the people it served would see it every day, a few words had been painted, words that Cornelius had said on the night the house was born, that no one needs anyone's permission to be worthy of respect. And there was a young man named Theo, a busser who had been turned away from 3 other jobs because of the way he looked, who came to that center, frightened, and was trained there, and who said, years later, that the first time anyone in a fine room had ever looked him in the eye and called him by his name was the day he walked into the house that an old waiter's daughter had built. And near the doors of the grand dining room, set into the wall where every person who entered would pass it, there was a small glass case. Inside the case, resting on a cushion of dark velvet, there was a single worn brass badge, a little disc of metal rubbed soft and smooth. On opening night, the old man came to that case on his daughter's arm, dressed in a fine new coat, and the room quieted as he crossed it. Cornelius Bellamy stood before the glass case, and he reached into his breast pocket one last time, and he took out the badge he had carried over his heart every working day of his life, and he held it for a long moment in his open hand. And then, with his own fingers, he placed it into the case, where it would stay, for everyone who entered the house that bore his name to see. Beneath it, a small plate had been set, and it did not say very much. It said only that this house was named for a man who served in this room for 41 years, and who taught his daughter that no one needs anyone's permission to be worthy of respect. Someone asked Cornelius, that night, as he stood with his hand resting on the top of the glass and the full warm room behind him, whether this was what justice was supposed to feel like. The old man thought about it for a long time. He looked at the firing of the men who had wronged him, and he found that he felt very little about it. He looked at his own name carved above the door, and he found that it embarrassed him more than it pleased him. And then his eyes went across the bright, crowded room and found, at a far table, that young busser in a crisp white shirt, a boy of perhaps 19-9, clearing plates with careful hands, learning the same craft Cornelius had given his life to. And Cornelius smiled, and he said that justice was not the men who lost their jobs, and it was not his name on the wall. Justice, he said, was that boy. A boy who would learn this work in a house where the front steps were his too, who would never spend 41 years being told which door he was allowed to use, who would grow up knowing, from his very first day, that he was already, and always had been, a whole and worthy man. That, the old waiter said, was what it was all for. So here is what the silent verdict would ask you to carry away from the story of Cornelius and Ada Bellamy. The way a person treats someone they believe to be powerless, someone they think can do nothing for them and nothing to them, someone they have decided is nobody, is the single truest measure of who that person really is. Preston Wexley believed he was looking at two people who did not matter. And in that belief, he showed the whole world exactly what he was. He did not know that the quiet woman in the plain coat owned the ground beneath his feet. But that is the point. And it is the lesson. And it is the thing worth remembering long after the lights of that grand dining room have gone dark. You should treat the old man in the flat shoes with dignity, not because he might secretly own the building. You should treat him with dignity because he is a man. And that is reason enough. And it always was. Dignity is not a thing that the powerful hand down to the worthy. It is a thing every person carries already. The way Cornelius carried his brass badge. Over the heart. Through every cruelty. Unbroken. And the moment you decide that some person in front of you is furniture, is a chair, is a lamp, is less than a whole human being, you have already told the world the truth about your own soul. And you do not get to choose who is listening. A man gave 41 years of quiet, excellent, unrespected work to a place that treated him as nothing. And in the end, his daughter made certain that the room which erased him would carry his name and his purpose for as long as it stands, so that no one who comes after him will ever have to earn, with 4 decades of suffering, the simple human respect that should have been his on the very first day. If this story moved you, if you have ever been judged by a stranger's cruel glance, if you have ever watched someone you love be looked through as though they were not even there, then take a moment now. Tell us in the comments who in your own life carried that weight with a straight back so that you would not have to. And say their name, so that we can honor them together. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity before they prove a single thing about who they are, then subscribe to The Silent Verdict. And share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because the next time the world decides that someone is nobody, it might just be standing in that person's house. And it does not get to choose when the truth walks through the door.